Good, and I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm Rabbi Deana Berezin. I'm the Associate Rabbi at Temple Israel, and it's lovely to get to study with all of you tonight. Shortly, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Dembitzer, who's going to be here late because he has minyan, and then he'll join us about halfway through or so. So we are going to begin this evening a three-part session on anti-Semitism, history in modern times. It's not going to be a history of anti-Semitism. We're not going to go chronologically through everything, and each of the people teaching, each of the clergy members teaching will have their own take on what they're going to focus on. For my part, what I am going to focus on during our time are talking about, first of all, a couple of definitions of anti-Semitism, talking about some broad concepts, and then what I really want to explore with you guys is the idea of what do we do when there is anti-Semitism in progressive spaces, right? There's lots of different spaces where there's intersectionality of Jewish values where we want to be part of community things, whether that's the Women's March or racial justice or other kinds of things where there's also anti-Semitism present. And how do we balance our desire to be doing social justice work in the community, and also making sure that we are balancing that with our own Jewish identities and figuring out where we stand on that. So it's a really fascinating subject to explore. I expect that there's going to be some discussion. And I brought some source material, so I'm gonna pass this out to those who are here in person. And then I'm gonna share my screen with you guys who are. I can get it later. That kind of worked. Yeah. Okay. So I brought two different pieces of that we're gonna look at. I brought a few selections from this book that's really good. I just started reading it, called Anti-Semitism Here Now by Deborah E. Lipstadt. And Deborah Lipstadt is one of the most well-known scholars on anti-Semitism. She's prolific. She had a movie written about Denial a few years ago, if you guys saw it, where it was a discussion about her work and a Holocaust deniers work, and it was in London, I think is where it took place. So it's a really good movie, you should watch it, but that's not the point of tonight. So I have some pieces that we're going to talk about here. And then at the end, there is a piece, a blog post from reformjudaism.org called To March or Not to March. That is not the only question. And it's about this kind of question that we're talking about progressive values in the Women's March and where anti-Semitism comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for those of you who are online. Karen, it worked. Can you all see that?
Good.
Okay.
I see the top of the document.
Okay.
There we go.
So this is just the title page to let you know where this came from. This is, as I said, Anti-Semitism Here and Now by Deborah E. Lipstadt. So I want to start, we're going to just start it by looking at a couple of definitions. So there's a couple of different pieces that she uses to help us understand what it is that anti-Semitism is, because it's really complicated. And, as some people say, sometimes you just know it when you hear it, or you know it when you see it. There's not necessarily an all-encompassing definition of anti-Semitism, because sometimes it's a feeling, sometimes it's not so concrete, and that makes defining it really hard. So she talks about it, and this book is kind of set up in letter format, where she writes to these two fictional people and about questions about anti-Semitism, and they respond to her and she responds to them. So it's a fictional account, but this is about asking about a definition. So at the top of the page, she says, the problem is when you know it, when you see it, only works when we can identify anti-Semitism's essential elements and its building blocks. So we have to, as she says, unpack the contents of the hatred, because once it's identifiable, then we can allow our instincts to check in. If you cannot define something, you can't address it or fight it. That's what she says. So I wanted to review with you just a couple of definitions of what anti-Semitism looks like and sounds like, and then talk about, you know, how we feel about those, and then dive into the other pieces. And gonna keep in mind, I'm gonna try and kind of move us along a little bit faster through this first part, because Rabbi Dembitzer is gonna take over in a little bit, and we got a little bit of a late start with the technology. So here we go. So this is one of the definitions. It says the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's descriptor, which has been adopted by the European Parliament, defines anti-Semitism in this indented paragraph. Would somebody be willing to read that aloud for us?
Where was that?
It's on the first page. It says page 15 at the top.
A certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities.
Okay, thank you. So what's interesting here is that it does actually identify non-Jews as potential targets of anti-Semitism, because as it talks about, you know, that there's like passive anti-Semitism and how people can still be on the receiving end of anti-Semitism, even if they themselves are not Jewish, because of stereotypes, quite frankly, right? So there's this idea that it's a certain perception that could be expressed, it could be rhetorical or physical manifestations, right? So there's lots of different, that's a broad category.
Or as Hitler once said, that Jew Roosevelt.
Right, you know, there's lots of slurs and lots of rhetoric that goes around, that like you can't pinpoint to say like this, and this are anti-Semitism, because that's exclusionary, right? So that means that you have to be able to have a definition that encompasses other kinds of things like rhetoric, lots of different pieces. But then the historical sociologist Helen Fine includes in her definition some additional important elements that I think are really interesting too. So that's at the bottom of, starts at the bottom of the same page. It starts with a persisting latent structure. Would somebody like to read that?
A persisting latent structure of hostile beliefs towards Jews as a collectivity, manifested in individuals as attitudes and in culture as myth, ideology, folklore, and imagery, and in actions, social or legal discrimination, political mobilization against Jews, and collective or state violence, which results in and or is designed to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews.
Thank you. Okay, so she adds a few different things in her definition to kind of expand it a little bit. And one of the key things that Deborah Lipstadt notes is that the operative word here is persisting, right? This is a persistent thing. It's not one time somebody is angry over a specific event. This is a persistent, continual attitude, action, all of these things. Persisting is the operative word here. So these are kind of some working definitions of what this means, right? That there's lots of different ways that anti-Semitism might be described, but we need a kind of collective language to talk about anti-Semitism, because until you have the basic building blocks, you have to, then you can, as she says, your instinct can kick in and you can say, you'll know it when you see it, or you'll know it when you feel it, once there are some basic building blocks in place. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so the next thing I want to draw your attention to is this idea about, on the next page, it says, for those of you in person, on page 83, it talks about cognitive failure, right? So the question here, which I think is really interesting, that I just wanted to bring up before we kind of dive into the next subject, is like, is fighting anti-Semitism a matter of showing people how ridiculous their anti-Semitic theories are? And as if you say anti-Semitism is irrational and delusional, can you educate people? What is the solution, right, of anti-Semitism? And I found that this was really fascinating, this question, because in so many scenarios of ignorance, right, we say that the solution is education. The solution is to teach and to learn and to experience. And I'm wondering what you all think of that.
No, not at all.
Not at all, okay.
I mean, it's helpful, but it's not nearly as important as people being decent. You know, I think one of the things they found out with people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, I know there have been studies done where they said the one thing that the rescuers most had in common was their being inarticulate. That they couldn't explain why they did what they did, but they said, that's just wrong. And once they're decent, they're not going to be anti-Semitic. Some of the worst Nazi anti-Semites were very well educated regarding the Jews. So that's not that education is a bad thing, but
No, I'm saying it's a bad thing. I just, to my mind, it's a question mark, right? Like, is there a way of teaching enough that anti-Semitism could be solved? And for those of you online, you feel free to raise your hand. I can call on you, type into the chat, or just, let's have a conversation. Is there such a thing as being able to educating, as she says, educate the haters?
I actually think there are some people who simply enjoy hating other people. And with that type of human being, I don't believe all the education in the world is going to help.
That's interesting. Anybody else?
There's a lot in the Christian New Testament I'm learning that it puts down to. I read a letter that Martin Luther wrote.
Yeah.
well, I think,
That was horrible. I mean, it could have been a playbook for my country.
Yeah, and it's really hard when people who are influential, right, write things in a religious rhetoric, and preach it as truth, right? That's really hard to educate around. That makes it difficult.
I think it's just ideology is so dangerous too. I mean, it can be a big problem. And I think still we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later in this, but the number one problem with anti-Semitism now is radical Islam, where they have a very carefully worked out ideology that is combines an ignorant interpretation of Islam with just a lot of hatred.
Hatred is hard to break. And I want to read you a few lines of what Deborah says, because in some ways she agrees. So basically, she says, we all reflexively fall back on education as an antidote. Education will certainly work in many instances, but I must sadly acknowledge education will be of limited value for committed anti-Semites. Their contempt for the Jew is not the result of a cognitive error. It's not that we simply need to rationally show them that Jews do not in fact control the banks or the media or shape the foreign policy of whichever country they live in. Their view of Jews is unfortunately refracted through a pre-established prism of hatred. And that's why these irrational, absurd charges make sense to them. So, that's a really hard thing to cope with also. We're talking about an entity, right? Hatred as a whole. It's this idea, in Judaism, we call it sinat chinam, right? This baseless hatred, which in our Jewish text, it says that it's baseless hatred in part that caused, the temple to be destroyed and things like that. This idea of baseless hatred being the cause, that it's very hard for education to fight baseless hatred. However, what I will say is that sometimes we've seen that it's not education, but it's interaction, right? It's relationships that actually change people's hearts and minds. And we recently even saw that at Temple. We had some anti-Semitic stickers put up around our building. And the perpetrator sat down with our executive director, and they had, they sat down over beers, right? And talked about it, and a relationship of sorts formed out of that, which is pretty miraculous in many ways, right? And so sometimes it's not the education, right? It's not the reading of books. It's not the proving that what you believe could not possibly be true or not true. It's the relationship building. And I think that that's a really interesting conversation. And so I want us to think about that question of like, what is it that is going to help change anti-Semitism and hatred in general into the next piece of the conversation. I think I see a hand raised, but I don't know who it is. So if you raise your hand, just unmute yourself and go ahead and start talking. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I think I accidentally raised my hand. I think what I was talking about previously was simply just there can be something psychological that while you are putting others down, you're at the same time putting yourself up. And I think that can play into it.
Okay,
So,
unmute.
yeah.
Okay, I think some people, and especially I found it with children, they don't even know why they hate. They seem to have learned it in the cradle because their parents hate, and they just act it out and they have no reason no background of why they're doing it.
Yeah, so sometimes it doesn't come from logic, therefore it's very hard to fight it with logic, right? But I want us to take these question marks, right, of if it's not education that's going to help change people's hearts and minds, what is it that is going to change people's hearts and minds? And if it is in fact relationships, right, as a potential, how does that impact how we interact with other people in the world? And that's what I want to focus on today. So a few years ago, the Women's March was launched. And I want to talk about that a little bit to help us understand this next piece. Okay, so there's a lot of places where anti-Semitism is intermingled with, with lots of other different kinds of social justice issues, right? So Deborah Lipstadt talks about the 2017 Chicago Dyke March, where, at the rallying community picnic, 3 women who were carrying rainbow flags emblazoned with a Jewish star were told by one of the organizers to leave because they looked like Israeli flags. So this idea that like Israel and Zionism and everything needing to be labeled in such a way makes that people not to be able to be there because it was too triggering. It made participants feel unsafe. And this idea that you can't both be a Zionist and who support it, that you support both Israeli and Palestinian statehood, right? That you can't hold different pieces. So also, we run into this in the Black Lives Matter movement, this question of where Zionism fits into the equation. We run into this in the Women's March in particular. So I want to talk about the Women's March in general. This idea that, so leftist anti-Semitism is what it's talking about, right? So Linda Sarsour, who's a Palestinian American activist and former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York, was a co-chair of the 2017 Women's March and tweeted in 2012, "Nothing is creepier than Zionism," to which she appended, "Challenge racism, embracing the idea that Zionism is racist." So there's a lot of different questions about where Zionism is, what Zionism means, and how the Palestinian question plays into the idea of racism. And then therefore, in a lot of liberal spaces, it's challenged that how can you both be a Zionist and believe in racial justice and believe in X, Y, or Z, LGBTQ rights, all of these different pieces. So there were a lot of questions about, Linda Sarsour and, Mallory, Tamika Mallory, and another, some of the other organizers of the Women's March, who are perceived to be anti-Semitic because of their associations with, people with Farhan, another leader in the very anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist movement. And so the question became for a lot of Jewish people, how is it that we can participate, should we participate in the Women's March, if anti-Semitic rhetoric is happening in the midst from the organizer level, right? Not just from the participants, but from the organizers, from the people who are part of the coalition. If there's anti-Semitism in the form of mostly anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Zionist sentiment, can we or should we still be part of the organization? Should we be endorsing things like the Women's March? Should we be participating on a congregational level, on a community-wide level, if there's anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist rhetoric? Which also brings up the question is whether anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism, right? So that's a big question. But where is our space, right? Where is our line, and how is it that we make those decisions as progressive Jews with these values, if there's also some perceived anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, anti-Zionism in those spaces too?
Isn't it especially important to participate, I would think, and then speak out against them? I think with a group like Black Lives Matter, I think they're just almost an evil group in the sense that their platform actually endorses indirectly anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli positions, and for that matter, anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-private property, anti-family in their platform. When you read their platform,
I'm not sure I agree. We can agree to disagree.
okay.
But I don't see that in there. But I think that there's a lot of important things to talk about. But the question at hand of whether we think that if there is, anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism on a leadership level, and not even just a leadership platform level, but in a participant level, and there's, where there's rhetoric around how can you be part of the racial justice movement and also be pro-Zionist and all of those questions. How is it, should we be part of that? And what I hear you say is like, absolutely, we should be part of that.
Speak out.
Because we need to be clear that this is a space for us too. Oh, just come on over, have a seat. Hi, Rabbi Ari.
I think that's a really good point you bring up.
So this is a big question. Anybody else, have any insights? I will turn it over to you.
No, it's fine. I can listen. Happens once in a while.
So, these questions of where is our space, right? Lynn, sorry, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. The first thing that popped into my head is I'd want to know what their definition of Zionism is. I mean, sometimes you have to figure out what somebody's definition is before you can correct it. Or, you have to learn, like, what is their definition? What is it that you believe Zionism is that you are so against it?
Yeah, and in that space, the question of whether or not you can educate, like, will education matter in understanding is comes up again. So, Michael, right? Michael's saying we should absolutely be in those spaces and not say we're not going to participate because it's our obligation to educate, to speak out and correct unfair assumptions, right? And say that this is our value, and we still need to be in those spaces, because if we believe in the movement, then we should be present and speak out against it.
With a
Other
huge
thoughts?
with a huge disclaimer. Because people could say, well, you support this, therefore you agree with the leadership. That's an assumption, so it have to be a disclaimer
Yeah,
all the time.
that might be a good thing to do too. So I want to just read a couple of pieces from this is a blog post that's on the Reform Judaism website that talks about this question, right? Because there are a lot of rabbis and community members asking, how should we participate in the Women's March? Should we be participating in the Women's March, right? Aside, like, if this is part of this messy conundrum. So there's been a part like, should we march or sit on the sidelines? Is it best to engage or should we boycott? Right? There's a lot of conversations taking place in lots of spaces among progressive and Jewish organizations, women's organizations, Reform Jewish leaders, and of course, you know, the Women of Reform Judaism, which is who wrote this blog post. So says, why the ambivalence? The unities of principles of the march are aligned with our progressive values, and the urgency of advocacy on women's rights is felt by many of us. Yet there have been concerns raised about two of the Women's March organizers who we talked about, Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsour, who have been associated with positions that are at odds with ours. One is a supporter of anti-Semitic and homophobic minister Louis Farrakhan, and the other is a pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist advocate. So what they eventually come to is, and I think this helps give us some good ways to think about it, the decision is certainly not an easy one for any of us. Yet we can't shy away from the discussion as we continue to face these kinds of questions in the future if we hope to work in coalition. No longer are progressive movements managed by legacy organizations with long histories of collaboration and experience in developing carefully crafted policy statements based on compromise and negotiation. This is the age of social media, a time in which major movements like the Women's March are launched by a Facebook post and an informal coalescing of strangers. Today's activism is messy and undisciplined and chaotic. We either need to work to find a way to work with others within this environment, absent the comfortable structures and assurances of the past, or we will no longer be part of the conversation. As the debate rages on, we must refuse to allow others to define us. To those who on the left who proclaim that one cannot be both feminist and Zionist, I say we can, and I am. To those on the right who imply that anyone who joins in this coalition must be a self-hating Jew or an ally of anti-Semites, I say I am neither. So these questions about what spaces we should occupy and how we can help, you know, we talked about, can you educate the haters, right? That's how the language that Deborah Lipstadt asks us. Can education be an effective tool? And we talked about maybe relationship building needs to be the tool. Yeah, go ahead.
As long as we keep like school, separation of church and state, you can teach in public school and at least get some of the young kids to be thinking. Like, remember back in the days when LGBT was not so publicized? Well, like in a psychology class in 1992, excuse me, that's the first time I read about Harvey Milk. Okay, but they stuck it in there. And it, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And you can get other ways of
There's other ways of
teaching that the Christian Bible is not accurate.
so
Sorry.
I appreciate you all engaging in this conversation. We had some technical issues, which is why we're running a few minutes late on my end,
Keep
but
going.
you know, I think that these questions of how do we build relationships, how, like, what is our definition? We started with what is our definition of anti-Semitism? We looked at a couple from Deborah Lipstadt that she drew on. We talked about what does it mean to be, you know, can we educate people, or is it just such the rhetoric that cannot be reasoned with, right? And so how do we be in spaces with people who are anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and still live values that we proclaim to be important to us? And so I invite you guys to continue reading. I thought this book was really good. And I'm excited to finish reading it, and I'm gonna turn it over to Rabbi Dembitzer.
What I miss? Sounds like a lot. Okay. So topic anti-Semitism historically and today, I think it's a very apropos topic. I think it's very appropriate to understand that today's anti-Semitism is very much in the context of historical anti-Semitism. So I'm going to share one insight or one thought, which I think is, before I introduce that thought, I'm going to introduce that thought by saying the answer to the problem of anti-Semitism. You ready for this? I'm going to give you the answer. It's very similar to an answer, Mark, that I gave 2 weeks ago. Mark, what was the answer 2 weeks ago? Everybody should become Orthodox. Less people laughed last time. So the question is, what am I talking about? How is that so, right?
Because we'd be the light of the world.
Good, that's true, although that sounds a little bit
Well,
pretentious, but I'm sorry, if I would say it would sound pretentious. So the question is, what am I saying when I think everyone should be Orthodox, which I do think everyone should be Orthodox, okay? So disclaimer, quote, I think everyone should be Orthodox. Why do I say that? So Rabbi Meir Simcha of Devinsk was a great rabbi. He died in, I believe, in the mid-1920s, 1925, maybe 1924. And he traces and he writes, his name is Rabbi Simcha Devinsk. He has a book called the Meshech Chachma, the book called the Or Sameach, the Happy Life, incredible work, definitely worth learning and reading. And in this, he describes how historically, from the times of Shem, Ham, and Yafet, which is the original Semite, Shem, to the times of Yaakov, Jacob in Egypt, to the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, all the way, get this, to 1920 or 1921, he says the cause for the Jewish people suffering so much in this world from anti-Semitism, from Esav son as Yaakov, which we're going to read in 2 weeks from now, from this idea that there is a spiritual idea of anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean it's a good thing, but there is this idea of anti-Semitism. There's going to be a force in this world that doesn't appreciate the Jewish people. Says the Meshech Chachma, this is a spiritual disposition. And the reason for it, says the Meshech Chachma, is when the Jewish people, the nation, starts to become too comfortable where they are. I didn't say this. I'm quoting it, and I believe in it. And he said, if you go through all those occurrences that he brings down, each one happened when we become too settled, too assimilated, too much like the nations around us. And I want to preface this by saying, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who is the greatest leader in America, in my opinion, incredibly ultra-Orthodox, says that America, the United States of America, is an incredibly Medina shel Chesed, a country of kindness and love. And we are so fortunate to be civilians and citizens of this country. But when the Jewish people get too assimilated and too comfortable somewhere, says the Meshech Chachma, there's a wind of change. And there's a wind that comes and wants to uproot the Jewish people and say, hey guys, you're missing the boat. Know who you are. Because if you don't know who you are, other people are going to tell you who you are. And it's not a positive thing. The Meshech Chachma wrote in 1922 or 1923, perhaps, that when Berlin becomes Jerusalem, bad things will happen. 15 years before the Holocaust. That's all I got. I mean, that was pretty dramatic.
Do either of you have any degree of agreement with that classic book by Prager and Telushkin, why the Jews in regard to anti-Semitism, where they argue that a good part of anti-Semitism comes from the fact that Jews are Jewish, that they worship one God and therefore they have one moral standard, which is very frustrating to a lot of people. They don't like that. And also that through the Talmud, through their community, they keep a sense of rather a close-knit, a unity that other people fear, or they find them, this kind of clannishness worrisome.
I don't know the work. I didn't read it, but I could, if I can speak to it, even though I never read it, but the idea and the ideology. So I want to put issue number one to bed. Like, This is a big deal. There's something to think about, right? When the Jewish people become too assimilated and too inundated by the country that they're in and become too familiar or to become too comfortable, there is this idea, and there's a precedent for historical anti-Semitism that says, boom, somebody's going to wake us up. So I think whether we're living in those kind of days right now, I'm not a prophet. I wouldn't claim to be a prophet. I think I would be kicked out of the room, but I don't have that level of understanding. But I do have this knowledge of precedent. And there is a precedent for anti-Semitism that goes before 2021, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israel. There's something that goes way before. I want to speak to your point. That's one idea of an anti-Semitism. There's another idea of an anti-Semitism, which is, what did Hitler say? Hitler said those Jewish people, they brought conscience to the world. That's terrible. I have no problem with religion up there. I don't mind God being there. I don't want God to tell me how to use the restroom. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. He's saying that. I want to live my life. I'm fine with the synagogue. I just can't deal with the house being holy as well. So there is this idea of like, don't tell me that God is watching everything that we're doing, because that's essentially what we're saying, right? So that is, I think, or at least, I don't know if that's what they're saying, and yeah, I don't know, I'm not doing justice to it. I'm gonna tell you maybe before them, but there are midrashim that speak to that idea. So second idea about anti-Semitism is that, there is this level of consciousness that the Jewish people bring to the table that could make people uncomfortable, okay? Level number three, and this is a complicated one because I'm telling everyone to be Orthodox, but I'm also telling everybody, if you're Orthodox, you gotta be really careful because you represent something. And that's what we call a Chilul Hashem. And if a person is representing something very holy and yet act in very unholy ways, that causes a lot of hatred. And I think that's what we call a Chilul Hashem, we call a desecration of godliness, which really doesn't have any forgiveness. It doesn't really have, it's very difficult to walk that path. It's very difficult to represent something. Here I am, I'm this devout, let's say, great, you use the word Orthodox, I don't like the word Orthodox, but great devout Orthodox Jew, and I'm stealing. That causes a lot of disappointment and perhaps a lot of hatred. Now, I'm saying that all these three ideas really come together. They're all linked up together. I don't think that this came first. I think there is a spiritual disposition in this world based on what the Meshech Chochmah or Meir Sibka is saying, and others have said before him, i.e. the Torah has said, Yaakov, that there is an existence, whatever, we don't know who Esav is. We don't know what Esav is. We don't know what Esau represents. We can learn about it and expound upon it, but we all know that there is this energy in the world. That doesn't mean that I don't have a responsibility in trying to educate. That doesn't mean that I don't have this responsibility to present nicely. If I'm a rabbi, I should walk around like a rabbi. This is what my wife just told me before I left the house, right? So there is a certain amount of representation. I have to present nicely, and I have to represent. I'm representing an ideology that I believe has a tremendous value. And if I don't, I'm causing a desecration. And idea number three is that when does the nation of Amalek, which represents anti-Semitism, biblical anti-Semitism, historical anti-Semitism, or modern day anti-Semitism, when does Amalek rear its ugly head? A few different times, and this speaks to your point, okay? A few different times. And if I'm talking too much, I apologize. I have to make up for not being the first half. Okay. So, number one, this is a very interesting idea, and it's related to Zionism. Rabbi Charlap, whose son was a rabbi here before me, 1923, 100 years ago. So his father, an incredibly deep thinker, Kabbalist, he explains, listen to this message. Amalek, which represents anti-Semitism, the nation of Amalek, which represents the ideology of anti-Semitism. Everybody know what Amalek is? Am I, okay, good, so I'm going to explain. Amalek is a descendant of Esav, is a descendant of this brother of Jacob who hates Jacob, okay, whatever that means. What? Esau.
Esau, a descendant of Esau.
Descendant of Esau is Amalek. And we have this idea that the nation of Amalek, Amalek represents a real challenge to the Jewish people. There's wars throughout our prophets against the nation of Amalek. There's actually, without going so much into it, Amalek represents anti-Semitism historically. Okay? Listen to this, Professor Gelman. Says Rabbi Charlap, if you look historically, when Amalek rears its ugly head, i.e. wants to challenge the Jewish people, historically is when the Jewish people are on the way into the land of Israel, in the desert, on the way to the land of Israel, comes Amalek from behind. This is in the Torah, it's in the 5 books of Moses. They want to attack us from behind, or Trubitz. You know that, right? Fine. Time number 2, listen to this. It's all based on a Midrash, but is a story of Purim. On Purim, when actually there's a resettlement in the land of Israel, times of Ezra or Nehemiah, Mordechai, the great Mordechai, is actually, according to a lot of opinions historically, is an emissary from the land of Israel to convince people to move back to Israel. Now Haman doesn't like that. Haman comes from Amalek. So therefore, they want to stop the Jewish people from going back to the land of Israel. Says Rabbi Charlap, time number 3, and there's historical precedent for that is the word Germamia, but there is also this modern day times when all of a sudden, very much in the same time period of Zionism getting stronger and stronger and stronger, all of a sudden there comes to rise a power called Nazism, which has historical roots, according to some opinions, to the nation of Amalek. So what do all 3 of those have in common? It's when the Jewish people are starting to get reconnected to the land of Israel. So what? Totally blabber. I'm totally getting enough. I'm gonna rant.
No,
Is
it's,
that okay?
what do you think about Martin Luther?
Well, let me finish. I just want to finish this thought.
I'm sorry.
But you're right. We could tie it in, but the thought, and this is what Professor Gemler was saying, I think, is that what is the land of Israel for the Jewish people? What is it? That's a question. What is it? Rabbi Kirchhoff,
The sanctuary.
a sanctuary, a place of a safe place for us? Omaha's not safe.
Oh, next year in Jerusalem.
So what is this? What does the word sanctuary mean
Um,
for you?
a place of safety and coming home to.
But today Israel is not necessarily safer than Omaha.
It's,
Right?
yeah.
So but you're right. Okay, maybe ideally.
No, you're ideal.
But according to how Rabbi Charlap, again, my predecessor from 1900 years ago, his father, where he explains that the land of Israel represents us living a physical, indulgent lifestyle and connecting to the Creator through a physically indulgent lifestyle. That means that there's mitzvahs, there's commandments that are very connected to the earth. In Omaha, there's less commandments that we have that are connected to the earth. In the land of Israel, there's so much connected to the earth. There's an army, there's a government, there's so much that has to do with mundane, or seemingly mundane. Now, why does Amalek not like that? Because what Amalek is saying, this nation, this ideology, and pardon me for getting a little too deep and too spiritual, but the ideology is saying, wait a second, if the Jewish people are going back to the land of Israel, then really what it says is that God is present everywhere. And that I can have an engaged in a relationship with God through the mundane and physical. I'm not comfortable with that thought. I am comfortable with church. I am comfortable with synagogue because I can devote 2 hours of my day or my week or Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur once a year to doing the Jewish or exchange the word Jewish for spiritual. I'm not comfortable with 24/7. That really bothers me, says Amalek, because that's going to make it heavy. Because I don't like not doing what I want to do when I want to do it. Is that another way of saying?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Do you like mine better?
I really like it.
Okay, good, thank you. So there is this idea, this spiritual ideology, which is the origin, which is Esau, which is the original anti-Semite, we'll call for now, although it's more complicated than that, or Amalek, which doesn't really appreciate this idea of Judaism as 24/7.
Isn't another way, another facet of that, that they bring out in the book is that, one of the great strengths of Judaism and one of its contributions is its intolerance in terms of the fact that it actually proclaims there's one God. And one of the things that, that the ancient Romans or the Greeks found very disturbing about the Jews was that, hey, what's the matter? Why won't you accept our gods? We'll accept, the more gods, the merrier. Go ahead, bring them in. But the Jews all of a sudden can't have idols. What's the story? And what, of course, to me, that one of the things I value so much about that tradition is that it says there is such a thing as a moral standard that applies to everybody.
Professor Gemler, you officially are an Orthodox rabbi. But that's, there's more. I can continue rambling.
I like it.
You like it. I don't know if anybody else does, but I'll do it anyway. So the last thought is also very practical. I don't know that we're gonna, my ideology or my viewpoint is that I'm not gonna spend my lifetime trying to convince an anti-Semite why they shouldn't be an anti-Semite. I think that I may get somewhere, but I'm not gonna get where I need to be. I'm gonna convince myself and be confident of myself and why I do what I do. And by definition, then become a light, hopefully, to the world around me. So the more I'm working on myself, you know what, let's go back to the first commentary in the Torah, the first commentary in the Bible, Rashi. Not the first, meaning the first Rashi in the Torah. Rashi says something very peculiar, weird. Rashi says, if the Torah, if the Bible is essentially an instruction manual of how to live a Jewish life or spiritual life, why start with the creation of the world? What does Rashi say? Anybody know? Quotes of Midrash. Rabbi Kurchavitz. He quotes Rabbi Kurchavitz and he says, or Rabbi Yitzchak, and he says that there's going to come a time that the nations of the world challenge the Jewish people's right, doesn't use the word right, challenge the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel. And therefore we start from the creation of the world. What? Does that make sense to anybody? It's hard to understand. That's why the Torah starts with the creation of the world, 6 days of creation, and Saturday, and Adam and Eve, and the tree of knowledge, and just so we can get to the land of Israel, and people who differ with us and our connection with it won't have a voice because we can show them what the Torah says. And let me ask you a question. The anti-Semite cares what Rashi says? Does the anti-Semite care?
Some people can't abstract.
What's that?
Some people can't abstract. They have to
So
say,
then what's the point of saying it then?
right,
So
and
I'm
that's
asking.
right.
So
That's
there's a
what we're
nuance.
up against.
There's a nuance I want to just point out from my predecessor's father, Rabbi Charlap, who says it doesn't say that we can show the nations of the world, or let's say the anti-Semites from the nations of the world, that look, it says here that it belongs to the land of Israel. It belongs to the people of Israel. It doesn't say that. It says, Koach Ma'asav Higid Li'amo. It's for the Jewish people to understand. It's for the Jewish people to understand the role of Israel in their lives. For the Jewish people to understand the role of Torah in their lives. And the more we deepen our understanding of what it is that we're a Jew, the less, and this may be counterintuitive, it makes people around me uncomfortable. The more in lack of confidence that I have, and therefore I have to scream it from my rooftop, or I have to try to convince you, that might make people more uncomfortable. Where was I
Makes
going?
sense. Yeah, the more confident one is, the more relaxed people are around the person who is confident.
So that's very true. So just to bring in my rant, I'm going to go back to my original statement. Everybody should become Orthodox.
Well, it says in the Bible that someday the Jews, the people who aren't Jews are going to grab onto the hem of a Jew's robe and say, we know you are right and we want to learn from you.
Okay, so we have our work cut out for us.
Yes, it says that in our Bible somewhere, in the Jewish Bible somewhere, but I don't know where.
Okay.
So we got to practice.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, we have our job. It starts tonight, really. All right? No? Did I lose everybody? Is it okay? I can keep going. Any questions? Can we do questions? Are we supposed to do questions?
Yeah, if there's any, I don't see any in the chat.
It's either a good sign or a bad sign.
Yeah, it's unclear. We're gonna assume that means that you loved everything that we said and, okay, I guess we did.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys for studying with us tonight. I think round 2, not consecutive, different topic next week. So I think anti-Semitism will come back around in a few weeks, right? Mark?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Right, that's a good
Very
question. I can't read that last question. If we all become Orthodox, well, My answer to that is that it's not about orthodox. It's not the word orthodox. The point is that if we lose, if we are able to retain our identity in a very strong, deep way, this idea is going to be addressed, that there may not be a need for somebody to dislike me.
It's what the rabbi said, it's all relationships. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but will you tell me your name
Yeah,
again?
I'm Rabbi Deana Berezin.
Rabbi Deana said it's all on relationships. So if we know who we are and we have good relationships.
Good, well said.
Thank you both very
All
much.
right, thank you.